This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, February 15th, 1933, in Miami, a crazed, unemployed bricklayer named Giuseppe Joe Zangara shouts, "Too many people are starving," as he pulls out a gun and fires it at America's president-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This took place just after Roosevelt had delivered a speech to tens of thousands. Zangara fired 6 rounds. 5 people were hit, including the mayor of Chicago, who was with Roosevelt and then died shortly thereafter. Roosevelt himself escaped without injury, amazingly. So let's talk about the assassination attempt on Roosevelt. I would say pretty low on the list of assassination attempts when people make the list. And of course, I don't need to point out the sliding doors, what if moment of all of this. I mean, yes. Roosevelt almost being killed before he even starts his first term in office. Gosh, think about that. So here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Joe Zangara. He pulls out a gun and he yells a very interesting phrase. Too many people are starving. Now, we've talked a lot about how Roosevelt was the sort of, from the very beginning, the mark of a lot of conspiracy theories, accused of being a fascist or a communist. Doesn't seem to be where Zangara is coming from if he's yelling, no, too many people are starving and I need to kill this person. So what do we know about his politics and in addition to his mental state?
Well, one of the things we know is that he was speaking out of this moment of crisis. Sometimes I think we collapse the space between Black Friday, when the market crashes in 1929, and the start of the New Deal. But you have 3 or 4 years there where unemployment is skyrocketing, where people don't have access to food, and the federal government isn't doing much about it. And this sense of despair and desperation has been soaking in for people across the United States for years at this point. And Zangara, on the politics side, I think what we know about him is that he originally was going to try to assassinate Hoover, but it just so happened that FDR was in Miami. And so he was like, well, this is the president that's here. We don't yet have evidence that he's going to save us either. So here's my protest against this crisis.
I mean, I think we also have to take into account sort of his mental and physical well-being. You know, we don't know exactly what he was suffering from in terms of his mental health, but in terms of his physical health, you know, he complained of having chronic stomach issues and digestive issues. And I think that played a big role into his mental state when he committed this act.
Yeah, he had severe chronic pain. And we've talked recently about disability and how people move in and out of it, but this is a serious disability. To live with that kind of chronic pain, the mental toll that it takes, the physical toll that it takes, can play also into this feeling of despair and this idea that there's like no escape from the anguish that you're in.
Yeah. And, you know, so many of the stories in general we've talked about, but certainly these moments where people take these violent acts, I mean, you know, even if they're refracted through a political lens, they are often a result of very personal struggles. And, you know, Zangara says later, he's like, I don't hate Roosevelt personally. I hate all officials and anyone who is rich. And then he also says, since my stomach hurt, I wanted to make even with the capitalists and kill the president because my stomach was hurting for so long. So, you know, that's his logic. And, you know, I don't want to like overstate the sort of politics of this. But nevertheless, that first part of his statement is interesting. NIki, you hinted at it, that, you know, there is this just sort of anti-government feeling. Obviously, if he wanted to first kill Hoover and then he goes and kills Roosevelt, he wasn't thinking anything too deeply about the sort of political difference there. I mean, Roosevelt, you know, ran in 32 on the New Deal, on reforms, on addressing the very issues that Zangara and many others felt motivated by and felt viscerally in their day-to-day lives. But worth pointing out the kind of mix of both politics and personal struggles there.
Well, we should talk about the assassination attempt itself, because it's in Miami. In this, we've talked about this, the long period between when the president is elected and inaugurated, because presidents aren't inaugurated until March 4th at this point. And Roosevelt is kind of like, Hoover, you do your thing. I'm going to go give speeches and sort of lay out my plan for governing the country, which I will start doing when I get into office. And so he was down in Miami. He was in Bayfront Park. He had just given a speech to 25,000 people and is now in an open air convertible, which presidents seem to favor in this period. And Zangara got off like 5 or 6 rounds. So he was firing into this crowd of people and toward the convertible in which FDR was sitting.
One of the people who's hit famously, probably the most sort of notable moment of this story, is the mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak, I believe is how it's pronounced. He was in attendance. He gets hit in the stomach. It ends up being a mortal wound. There's some interesting details. We can talk about those in a second about the people who intervene and tackle the gunman. But Cermak is wounded, falls into Roosevelt's arms, and he basically cradles him on his way to the hospital. They arrive there. Cermak is taken into a room for treatment. He does die 19 days later, which is a couple days after Roosevelt's inauguration. But there is this famous and most likely not true line that Cermak tells Roosevelt in the hospital: "I'm glad it was me, not you." One of those resonant lines. I think it is on Cermak's gravestone.
Boy.
Most likely not true.
I was going to say, I highly doubt that.
Yeah.
It was probably something like, "Damn you."
Newspapers reported it without attribution, and then it went from there. Most scholars agree that it was never said. But, maybe another lesson in if a line seems way too poignant, it probably didn't actually get uttered.
But I think it speaks to that counterfactual that you opened with, which is because Roosevelt would go on to become such a consequential president, and because there were so many hopes placed in him, and because he was president of the United States, this idea that like he was irreplaceable in that moment, I think is reflected in the sentiment behind that line, and probably its non-veracity.
Yeah.
I will say, even though I just sort of said you should be skeptical of all the sort of poignant lines that trickle out from great moments in American history, I did just recently listen to a big, long podcast series on the JFK assassination. And, by all accounts, people really did kind of like just say sort of epic things in the hospital. The way that JFK's doctors talked to Jackie and the scene on the plane. I mean, all those things. There's a lot of apocryphal, not true stuff around the JFK assassination to be true, but there were some like moments there where you're like, oh my gosh, this played out as if it were, the way that Steven Spielberg could write it in the movie or whatever. But this line, reportedly, not the case. All right, the people who intervened here, often one of the more interesting elements of these stories, there's a woman named Lillian Cross, who is, by all accounts, the hero of the moment, if you can phrase it that way.
Yeah, and a woman saved the day.
Yeah.
Lillian Cross is the wife of a local physician and was literally standing right next to Zangara when he starts shooting toward Roosevelt. And she has this sort of gut reaction where she said she grabbed his arm and she pushed with all of her strength to push his arm into the air. She starts calling for help. Other men come to the scene. They grab his other arm. And the next thing she knows, he's being seized. But all in this moment, there's a funny little tidbit I think about. Before she goes to sort of shove his arm into the air, she has her handbag on her right arm and she transfers her handbag from her right arm to her left arm so that she can have more sort of maneuverability when she shoves his arm away. But that sort of fast thinking is what saved the day and what stopped him from killing even more people.
It's like unclipping your earrings before a fight. You got to get in the proper position.
Hosted by Lindsey Graham, Wondery's podcast American History Tellers takes you to the events, times, and people that shaped America and Americans. In the latest series, American History Tellers explores the Underground Railroad, a covert network of secret routes and safe houses operated by men and women committed to helping enslaved people escape bondage in the South. Follow American History Tellers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
They also said that, like, members of her family saw that she had powder marks on her cheek when she got home. Like, that's how close she was to the line of fire. And honestly, she's probably close to the gun because she's only 5'4". Mm-hmm. She's such a little petite woman, and she's in this moment kind of the hero of the day.
Okay, let me try and spin a ridiculous through line here.
Let's hear it.
Rosie Greer. Do you remember Rosie Greer?
Wow, yeah.
Okay, so Rosie Greer was the ex-football player who was a bodyguard for Robert Kennedy and famously took control of the gun and subdued Sirhan Sirhan when he shot Kennedy. Rosie Greer, we've done an episode about him. Rosie Greer, 6'5", former football player. This person we're talking about here, Lillian Cross, 5'4". Both play a very similar role one is an actual assassination, the other is an attempted assassination. Both play a very similar role, seizing a gun in the wake of an assassination attempt. Of Rosie Greer, 6'5", ex-football player, and Lillian Cross, 5'4", Miami housewife, which one went on to be famous for needlepoint?
Love it.
We have done an episode about Rosie Greer writing a book called Needlepoint for Men. I would like to think, I don't think they ever met, these two, but I would like to think that somewhere these two have met each other through the tides of history.
Yeah, he was following in her very tiny footsteps.
Exactly. All right. Should we get back to Zangara himself and talk about what happens there or any other sort of fallout from this story?
Zangara, when I think about sort of his health, they do an autopsy on him after he dies, and they find out that he had adhesions on his gallbladder. They tried to address his pain earlier in his life where he had his appendix removed, and some people said that that made his conditions worse, but I'm not sure if having his gallbladder removed would have helped his conditions, but he did legitimately suffer chronic stomach pains, and that might have been one of the issues was his gallbladder.
There also is, because there always is, a little bit of a conspiracy theory behind Zangara. This idea that actually his real target had been Cermak, because Cermak was the mayor of Chicago. Chicago is gang territory during this period, and so Zangara was secretly connected to organized crime, and he actually hit his intended target. So if you are looking for a conspiracy rabbit hole to go down, we have just provided one for you.
Right. Though, of course, compare this also to the conspiracy theories, sometimes mob-related or Cuba-related around the JFK assassination, and I think it's pretty easy to look and say, look, if you're a mobster mastermind and you're trying to pick someone to go kill the president, I don't think these are prime candidates. These guys don't have their act together. They suffer from a lot of problems. I don't think they're like the hired assassin types. So that to me is where a lot of these conspiracy theories fall apart. But
oh, wait,
right.
One more thing. We can't forget how Zangara died. I mean, we just did an episode on executions, and he also was sentenced to death row and faces death by the electric chair.
He was enraged, by the way, when he learned that there weren't going to be cameras at his execution, because he had seen it as an opportunity to give his final statement and to make a political statement. It does get recorded. We do know what he says. He says, "Viva l'Italia." He was an Italian immigrant. "Goodbye to all poor peoples everywhere. Push the button. Go ahead. Push the button."
Yeah. So I don't think there's been any depiction of this in popular culture, but it feels like this could be in a Netflix show or some other movie. And, we don't have to belabor this, but obviously the what if here is incredible, and I think it continues to. Actually, Zangara is in The Man in the High Castle. He plays a role sort of floating around in the background there, and that becomes an Amazon series. So he has his moments. I don't know. Do you have thoughts about the what if? The vice president elect was, can anyone name him? John Nance Garner. Do you think,
famously.
Yeah. Do you think Garner would have been? Oh, yeah. There you go. He was a Texas Democrat, not exactly the New Dealer that Roosevelt was. So if Garner becomes president in 33, who knows?
Trouble.
Who knows?
It would have looked pretty different. I mean, I think that the Man in the High Castle is great for counterfactual stuff. But because he was a conservative Democrat, God, I mean, I don't think you would have seen the robustness of New Deal programs. I don't think that he would have served 4 terms in office, so we don't necessarily need to worry about his approach to Europe during this period.
Yeah.
But it would have dramatically changed, I think, what the U.S.'s response to the Depression would have looked like.
One little tidbit, and then we'll wrap it up. But Garner apparently had a standing order to not be disturbed at night. He liked his sleep. And so he doesn't find out until the next day because they don't wake him up. They're not allowed to wake him up. So he wakes up the next morning. He finds out, there was an assassination attempt on Roosevelt. You may have also been president. He sends a telegram saying, "I'm infinitely rejoiced at your escape." And I wonder if Roosevelt fired a telegram back being like, "I hope you got some good sleep last night."
I mean, this is the real counterfactual, which is, had Roosevelt been assassinated, would Garner have been woken in the middle of the night? Or would they have waited until morning?
There you go. A standing order to sleep. I respect that.
Actually, I respect that too, man.
I'm not mad.
Let me sleep. I can wait.
All right. Well, we will leave that there and go listen to that Rosie Greer episode if you'd like. It's a really interesting one. But let's talk about some other stories that happened on this day, February 15th. Our first one is from 1879.
Yeah. In 1879, President Rutherford B. Hayes signed a bill allowing female attorneys to argue cases before the Supreme Court.
We just learn something new about Hayes every time. On this
right?
show.
I love that it took an act of Congress, by the way, for this to happen. But we'll talk about that some other day. And also on this day in 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine mysteriously blew up in Havana Harbor, killing more than 260 crew members and bringing the United States closer to war with Spain, even though I think it turned out to be a boiler explosion. Anyway,
well,
it got
and
blamed on
also
Spain.
maybe ginned up by the New York press. And, really fascinating stuff there. I don't know. Yeah, Remember the Maine is one of those both like very, very overexposed moments in U.S. history, but also totally, totally crazy if you sort of start to scratch at that. But pretext for war. Speaking of which, in 2003, millions of protesters, this was the day, February 15th, millions of protesters around the world demonstrated against the prospect of a U.S. attack on Iraq. I remember that day very, very well. And I think we've talked about this, but, it is this interesting thing where the Iraq War is kind of misremembered to me, even not that long later, in sort of 2 directions, which is one, the amount of coercion and manufactured consent around the war, but also the tremendous amount of pushback. And people have forgotten that the biggest protests in world history were in this era, on this day, in the run-up to the war, not just kind of as it became a clear disaster. So worth remembering this day in 2003. Okay, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.